A common issue I hear from people seeking to play Anima Beyond Fantasy is this. What do these numbers mean? And this is one of the legit criticisms I hear. In a vacuum, any given number you pluck out of a game or system won't mean much. 30 damage can be a lot or a little, but without knowing how much damage you can sustain normally, it's just a meaningless number. And this is one of the shortcomings you'll encounter in any given tabletop game that is as open-ended as Anima, Hero System, GURPS, or even Fate and Big Eyes Small Mouth are. The numbers mean nothing on their own. Thus, there is some required benchmarks that need to be set, since Anima doesn't give many guides for those examples. This means a little bit of independent analysis is needed. Even if you're not here for Anima, this video will show you part of the thought process I use when I try to figure out a new game. And the first, most obvious thing worth noting, the numbers in Anima are a full order of magnitude higher than what you'll find in the likes of Dungeons & Dragons. Anima uses a lot of double and triple digit numbers, compared to the singles and doubles you're more likely to find in Dungeons & Dragons. Our first instinct here should be to dust off your graphing or scientific calculator from your math or science class, or just pass this game up completely if you've got dyscalculia or some crippling math anxiety. Because the numbers will not go away in this game. So if it is reasonable to do so, get comfortable with big numbers. With that said, if you're still on board, let's try relating this scale to something familiar. I already mentioned Dungeons & Dragons, so let's see if there's some way we can do that. There's an obscure rule somewhere that says that anytime you're raising an ability, you must do so in units of 5. Raising attack, gotta do so by 5 points. Raising your appraisal skill, gotta do it 5 points at a time. This might be a useful tidbit. Let's now take a look at the dice that they use. It uses a D100, compared to D&D's D20, which 100 divided by 20 is 5. Well, would you look at that? A +5 in Anima, the lowest anything can be incremented by, is the same thing as a +1 in Dungeons & Dragons. So we know that the numbers here are just Dungeons & Dragons numbers times 5. But that still doesn't establish a baseline, because even in D&D and its various additions and derivative games, the typical starting point changes pretty often. So we're going to need to dig a little deeper. Now, Anima does have some sample characters, but they're not in the core book, so we can't use those as a reference point. Which, to be fair, Dungeons & Dragons doesn't have sample characters in their book either. You have to go online to find those. But outside of D&D, such as in Shadowrun or various tabletop role-playing games from Japan, you have pre-made characters right there to give you that starting point. No matter. This book is over 300 pages. If we keep digging, we're likely to find something we can use. Even though this book has no index, there's still a table of contents we can look through. And, conveniently, there's a list of common characters starting on page 278. So unless the GM is truly dedicated and intends on building everything from scratch, you can expect them to pull stuff from here. So this is probably our best bet to figure out a baseline for ourselves. And if you are the GM, trust me, pre-made stat blocks and characters are your friend. Somebody else has done the work for you, do not reinvent the wheel. I digress. There's some humanoids in here, humanoids from various walks of life. Their stats are kinda wimpy compared to what you can make following character creation rules as they're presented in the book. Take Bandit for example. They're level 1 and have only one above average stat, 6 in perception. So they don't have much in the way of bonuses. Almost everything they have is purely from their development points. So these guys are as good of a baseline as any. They've got 70 attack, 60 dodge, and 8 secondary abilities, with a minimum of 20 and a few stretching a little further for their secondary abilities. And with the class Freelancer, they have very modest bonuses from their class, pretty much exclusively to those secondary abilities. And there's a little bit of deviation from this if you look at some of the other level 1 characters, anywhere from 40 to 70 attack and defense, with anywhere from 6 to 10 secondary abilities being invested in, with 1 or 2 going higher than 20. Now that we have this starting point, let's consider how the numbers interact with one another via the dice rolls. 40 is what the game describes as an easy difficulty check. probably not likely to call for a roll, but let's convert this to D&D's scale by dividing it by 5. This gives us a difficulty class of 8 in D&D. In D&D 5th edition, somebody with a +4 in a particular roll, either because of a superbly high stat bonus, or a mix of +2 from both stats and proficiency at level 1, will need to roll at least a 4 or higher to succeed. And if we bump that up to DC 10, we know they'd need a 6 or higher. And so we can reconvert everything back to Anima by multiplying it by 5. That easy task with a target roll of 40 calls for a 20 or higher if somebody has a small investment of 20 in their secondary abilities. Meaning 80, moderate in Anima, is definitely where things get tricky and why the common characters will typically have only one secondary ability that will not have a problem with such difficulty rolls. Take a look at the Bandit's 50 notice. They want to be able to pick out who'd be the right target to rob. Let's also take a moment to consider how combat works in this game. It's a D100 roll against another D100 roll, with either side adding their attack or defense to their roll, depending on what side of the conflict they're on. And in order to actually deal damage, you need to score at least 30 higher on your attack roll. This means that two evenly matched fighters are likely to be locked in a stalemate until somebody gets a good hit on the other person. Thus, as a player, you want to have some strategies so that you can tip the odds into your favor. A few very basic ideas that come to mind are this: making 2 or 3 attacks against a target, since penalties for multiple defenses escalate quickly, and there are methods for reducing penalties when you're making multiple attacks. Or you can instead favor a much higher attack than your defense, since by the rules as written, if you get hit, you lose your action that turn if you haven't acted. So, stun locking an enemy is thus viable. Focusing a defense is also viable, since if your defense roll is higher than the attack roll, you can then counterattack, sometimes with a bonus that could compensate for a weak attack rating. And of course, my personal favorite, catching an enemy unaware or otherwise unable to see what's about to happen to give them a really nasty penalty on their defense roll. Now, it's not lost on me that there's a lot of steps in combat for Anima Beyond Fantasy. What with rolling for initiative every turn, rolling for attack and defense for every attack, and then resolving a counterattack, which is yet another attack and defense roll. And if there's a solid hit, you might also need to roll for resolving a critical hit, which is based not on end result, but rather the amount of damage dealt comparing to remaining life points, and with double or triple digits at every step of the way. It's overwhelming, and I don't fault anybody for shrinking away from this. But we know now that because of the amount of potential steps involved in just one round of combat, that this is probably a thing we don't want to emphasize precisely because of how time-consuming it can get. Thus, my old standby: if the players can find a clever way to subvert a battle, let them have their win. If you must make a battle mandatory, let the players have a moment to plan ahead to tip things in their favor when the chips are down, or allow them a chance to escape if things start going bad. An entire session could be studying or observing a potential target, and then getting the materials needed, taking steps to set up a trap to give the players an edge against their target. Monster Hunter comes to mind when I think of this. And it's also worth noting that there's a fairly robust skill system with the secondary abilities and other supernatural powers that are available in Anima. So if you can devise some non-combat conflicts, this is a good game for that. And if you're not, well, here's a tip that'll work for any game that's robust enough. Put a problem out in front of the players and do not plan or expect a particular solution. Just let the players puzzle it out themselves. And maybe don't make it so urgent that they must solve it as soon as possible. Now, this all sounds like a lot of effort to go through for a game that's been out of print for over a decade, or any game that you aren't familiar with in the first place. After all, why wrestle with a new subject matter when you can just get that instant dopamine hit from just sticking with what's familiar, such as, say, Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder? Well, I have a few reasons I can offer. Games and play are a low-stakes way animals practice their life skills. Humans are no exception to this. We just happen to have some more sophisticated skills that we use in our day-to-day lives. So, a game that uses math is a good way of practicing it in an environment where messing up won't cause major problems. And thus, when we do find ourselves in a situation calling for using math and reading comprehension, we'll thus be better prepared to handle it. Such as dealing with personal finances or filing taxes.